In the early hours before Mahogany Jackson vanished, nothing about the night announced itself as the prelude to a homicide. Alabama evenings in 2024 carried on as they always had humid air, quiet streets broken by the occasional car, the soft illusion of safety that routine creates. Mahogany moved through those hours as a young woman with plans still unfinished, relationships still unfolding, and a future that, to those who loved her, felt solid and assumed. It is only in retrospect that each small decision, each ordinary movement, hardens into evidence. What investigators would later describe as Mahogany's last known movements began without drama. She was seen, spoken to, remembered in fragments by people who did not know they were becoming witnesses. At the time, there was no urgency. Phones were charged, messages sent, plans loosely made. No one marked the moment as significant because nothing yet had gone wrong. This is often how violent crime enters a life, not with warning, but by slipping quietly into a gap between expectation and reality. When contact with Mahogany stopped, it did not immediately set off alarms. Silence, at first, is easy to rationalize. A missed call can be blamed on sleep. An unanswered text can wait until morning. Friends and family later told police that concern grew gradually, hour by hour, as normal explanations began to fail. The phone did not ring back. Messages went unread. The longer the quiet lasted, the heavier it became. By the time worry turned into fear, the night had already claimed its distance. Police would later rely on timestamps calls made, locations pinged. Sightings narrowed to reconstruct a window in which Mahogany effectively disappeared. That window, investigators said, was critical. Whatever happened to her happened quickly enough that no clear cry for help, no definitive warning, was left behind. For the family, those hours were chaos without clarity. Loved ones began reaching out to each other, comparing notes, try to align memories. Who spoke to her last? Where was she supposed to be? Did she mention meeting anyone? Each answer raised another question. What was missing was the one thing that could steady them, confirmation that Mahogany was safe. When authorities were notified, the case shifted from private panic to public procedure. Officers began with what they always do in the earliest stage, establishing a baseline. Who was Mahogany Jackson? Where did she live? What did she do for work? Who was regularly in her life? These questions are clinical, but for families they can feel intrusive, even accusatory, at a moment of acute vulnerability. Still, the process moved forward because it had to. Investigators treated the initial report as a missing persons case. There was, at that stage, no confirmed crime scene, no recovered evidence of violence. That absence is one of the cruelest aspects of the early timeline. Without proof of harm, urgency competes with protocol. Police canvassed areas connected to Mahogany's last known whereabouts. They asked neighbors what they had seen or heard. They reviewed available footage, looking for a figure that might pass unnoticed by most, but now carried unbearable significance. As daylight arrived, hope resisted alongside dread. Families often cling to the idea that disappearance does not equal death, that there is still time for a call, a knock at the door, a misunderstanding waiting to be resolved. In Mahogany's case, that hope would later be described by relatives as both necessary and devastating. Necessary, because without it they cannot function. Devastating, because of what came next. Authorities continued to piece together the timeline, tightening the margins around those last hours. They examined Mahogany's phone activity, not for content alone, but for rhythm when it stopped, where it last connected, what that silence might mean. Each technical detail narrowed possibilities, while simultaneously pointing toward reality no one wanted to name yet. The transition from missing to something is wrong often occurs quietly, inside the minds of investigators who begin to see patterns they recognize too well. In this case, police later acknowledged that inconsistencies emerged, details that did not align, movements that did not make sense if Mahogany had simply chosen to leave. Still, until she was found, everything remained provisional. What makes the opening phase of Mahogany Jackson's case so haunting is how familiar it is. There was no dramatic chase, no public confrontation captured on camera. There was only absence, stretching across hours, then days, and a growing realization that the silence itself was the loudest clue. The night she vanished became a fixed point in time, one that everyone involved would return to again and again, searching for meaning in moments that had seemed insignificant when they first passed. By the time investigators expanded their efforts, involving additional resources and personnel, the emotional weight of the case had already settled heavily on those closest to Mahogany. They waited for updates, for any confirmation that might resolve the unbearable uncertainty. Each phone call from authorities carried both hope and terror, because it promised answers but threatened to deliver the worst kind. This first stretch of the timeline ends not with resolution, but with tension fully drawn. Mahogany Jackson was still missing. The questions surrounding her last hours were multiplying, not shrinking. And somewhere between the ordinary night she stepped into and the morning that followed, something irreversible had occurred, something that would soon transform a search into a homicide investigation, and a young woman's name into a case file that demanded justice. The shift from uncertainty to devastation came not with speculation, but with discovery. When authorities located Mahogany Jackson, the case crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The search ended, but the questions multiplied, now sharpened by grief and urgency. What had been a missing persons investigation became a homicide case, and every decision made in those early hours would shape what followed. Law enforcement has been careful in how much detail they released about the location and condition in which Mahogany was found, a restraint meant to preserve the integrity of the investigation and protect her family from further harm. What was confirmed, however, was enough to strip away any remaining hope. Mahogany was dead. The manner of her death was determined to be a homicide. From that moment on, the narrative of the case was no longer about where she had gone, but about who was responsible for ensuring she never came back. For investigators, the discovery scene became the center of gravity. This is where timelines converge, where last known movements, witness statements, and digital traces are measured against physical reality. Officers secured the area, documenting everything methodically. Photographs were taken. Evidence was collected. Each step followed protocol, because in cases like this, mistakes made in shock can echo all the way to a courtroom. For Mahogany's family, the discovery marked the beginning of a different kind of suffering. The waiting ended, but certainty arrived in its most brutal form. Relatives later spoke of how the confirmation felt unreal, as though the words themselves could not fully land. There is a specific cruelty in learning that someone you loved did not simply vanish, but was taken deliberately, violently, and without mercy. Authorities began to brief the public in limited terms. They confirmed Mahogany's death and acknowledged that the investigation was ongoing. The language was controlled, cautious, and necessarily incomplete. Behind those brief statements, however, the pressure intensified. A homicide demands answers. It demands accountability. And it demands speed, not because justice can be rushed, but because every hour matters when evidence is fresh and memories are still intact. The autopsy process became a critical component of the timeline. Medical examiners worked to determine cause and manner of death, details that would later anchor the legal case. While the full findings were not immediately released, investigators emphasized that the results supported their conclusion that Mahogany had been killed. This confirmation solidified the direction of the investigation and narrowed the field of possibilities. As word spread, the community response was swift and emotional. Vigils were organized. Messages flooded social media. People who had never met Mahogany shared her name, her photo, and their outrage. This public attention can be a double-edged sword, bringing awareness and pressure, but also speculation and misinformation. Law enforcement urged restraint, reminding the public that facts, not rumors, would determine the outcome. Behind the scenes, detectives revisited everything they had gathered before Mahogany was found. Her last communications were re-examined with new urgency. Who had she been in contact with? What plans had she mentioned? Were there conflicts, tensions, or relationships that now took on dark implications? Each answer added weight to the growing case file. Witnesses who had spoken casually at first were interviewed again, this time with sharper focus. Timelines were compared and corrected. Small discrepancies minutes, Locations. Remembered details suddenly mattered. Investigators know that truth often hides in these margins, where memory falters and reality peeks through. The discovery also introduced a moral reckoning that extended beyond the facts. For many following the case, Mahogany's death raised familiar, painful questions about vulnerability, safety, and violence. These questions did not need exaggeration. They were inherent in the reality of a young woman killed in circumstances that, at first glance, appeared disturbingly ordinary. That ordinariness made the crime feel closer, more personal, and more frightening. Police leadership emphasized that they were pursuing all viable leads. They avoided naming suspects prematurely, a restraint meant to protect both the investigation and the rights of those involved. Still, it was clear that the focus had shifted from searching for Mahogany to reconstructing her final hours with precision. Every movement mattered now, because somewhere in that sequence lay the actions of the person or people responsible. For the family, each update from authorities was both necessary and unbearable. They wanted answers, but answers carried details they might never fully escape. Their grief unfolded under public scrutiny, a reality common in high-profile cases, but no less painful for those living it. By the end of this phase of the timeline, the case had reached a grim clarity. Mahogany Jackson was no longer missing. She was a victim of homicide. The scene had been processed, the autopsy initiated, and the investigation formally escalated. What remained was the hardest work of all, proving, step by step, how the crime unfolded and who must answer for it. This section of the story closes with the weight fully realized. The shock had settled into determination among investigators, among loved ones, and among a public demanding justice. The question was no longer whether a crime had occurred, but whether the system would move fast and carefully enough to ensure Mahogany's death did not become just another unresolved name. With Mahogany Jackson's death officially classified as a homicide, the investigation entered its most methodical and unforgiving phase. This was where emotion had to give way, at least on the surface, to process discipline and evidence. Detectives began rebuilding the case from the ground up, now anchored by the certainty that a crime had been committed and that someone, somewhere within the narrowing timeline, was responsible. The starting point was time. Investigators refined the window between Mahogany's last confirmed contact and the moment her body was discovered. That span became the frame through which all evidence was viewed. Phone records were examined not only for messages and calls, but for moving location data that could show where Mahogany's phone had been and when it stopped behaving like a device in active use. Gaps in that data were as important as what was present. Digital forensics extended beyond Mahogany herself. Detectives mapped her known relationships, looking for intersections, people whose phones appeared in the same places at critical moments, or whose accounts of the night did not fully align with objective data. This stage of an investigation is quiet but relentless. It is where stories are tested against timestamps, and where confidence can begin to fracture under scrutiny. Witness interviews intensified. Some individuals were asked to recount the same hours repeatedly, each time from a slightly different angle. Investigators were not looking only for lies. They were looking for stress points, moments where memory slipped or where an explanation felt rehearsed rather than recalled. These interviews were documented carefully, knowing that consistency, or lack of it, could later become central in court. Physical evidence gathered from the discovery scene was sent for analysis. While authorities remained tight-lipped about specific findings, they confirmed that the evidence supported a criminal act rather than an accident or natural cause. This confirmation allowed prosecutors to begin consulting with investigators early, ensuring that the case being built met the legal threshold required for charges. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Homicide investigations carry an unspoken clock. The longer they last, the harder it becomes to secure fresh evidence and reliable testimony. Detectives worked extended hours, following leads that ranged from promising to painfully inconclusive. Each dead end was logged, each possibility exhausted before being set aside. Public interest remained intense, and with it came challenges. Tips poured in, some helpful, many not. Officers had to sort through them all, knowing that even vague information can sometimes crack a case open. At the same time, they worked to shield the investigation from speculation that could contaminate witness accounts or prejudice potential jurors. Gradually, patterns began to emerge. Investigators identified inconsistencies that could no longer be explained away as simple misunderstandings. Certain accounts of Mahogany's final hours conflicted with established data. Movements did not line up. Timelines shifted under pressure. These discrepancies did not yet equal proof, but they sharpened the focus of the investigation. Authorities emphasized that the case was being built deliberately, not rushed. This was a message aimed as much at the public as at Mahogany's family, who were living in a state of suspended grief, waiting not only for justice, but for clarity. They attended briefings, listened to careful language, and tried to read meaning into what was said and what was left unsaid. Behind closed doors, law enforcement began preparing for the possibility of arrests. This stage requires confidence not just in suspicion, but in evidence that can withstand challenge. Every step taken from this point forward had to be defensible, documented, and precise. A weak case, even against the right person, risks collapse. The emotional toll on investigators is often invisible, but it is real. Working a case like Mahogany's means absorbing the details of her final moments over and over again while maintaining enough distance to think clearly. It is a balance that few outside the profession fully understand. As the investigation moved toward its next phase, one thing was clear: the narrative was no longer fragmented. The pieces were beginning to align into a coherent account of what happened after Mahogany disappeared. The focus narrowed, the questions sharpened, and the case edged closer to the moment when suspicion would give way to formal accusation. This section ends with a sense of inevitability that defines the latter half of many homicide investigations. The groundwork had been laid. The evidence was being tested and retested. And while nothing had yet been announced publicly, the direction of the case was becoming unmistakable. The search for Mahogany had ended. The search for accountability was approaching its most consequential turn. The final phase of the case unfolded without spectacle, but with consequence. When authorities moved toward accountability in the killing of Mahogany Jackson, it was a result of accumulated work rather than a single dramatic breakthrough. By this point, the investigation had narrowed decisively. The timeline was no longer fluid. It had weight, structure, and direction enough to support formal action. Law enforcement announced arrests after determining that the evidence met the standard required to move forward. The decision was not framed as closure, but as progression. In homicide cases, an arrest is not an ending. It is the beginning of a legal process that will test every conclusion drawn during the investigation. Charges were filed in accordance with the findings, and prosecutors outlined the framework of the case in careful, measured language. For Mahogany's family, the news brought a complicated mix of relief and renewed pain. Relief, because the person or persons believed responsible would have to answer publicly. Pain, because legal acknowledgement does not undo loss. Family members spoke through representatives in brief statements, emphasizing that Mahogany was more than a case number. She was a daughter, a loved one, a life taken unjustly. As the case entered the court system, the focus shifted again. Evidence that had once been held closely now had to be disclosed, organized, and prepared for scrutiny. Prosecutors and defense attorneys examined the same materials from opposing angles, each aware that the outcome would depend not only on what happened, but on what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Pre-trial proceedings moved forward deliberately. Motions were filed. Timelines were argued. The language of the case became legal rather than investigative, but the facts remained the same. Mahogany Jackson had been killed, and the state bore the burden of demonstrating how and why, using evidence gathered in the weeks following her disappearance. Public attention did not fade, but it changed in tone. Outrage gave way to watchfulness. People followed updates, not for shock, but for resolution. In communities shaken by violence, justice is often understood not as vengeance, but as acknowledgement that the system recognizes the harm done and responds with seriousness. Throughout this process, Mahogany's name continued to anchor the case. Advocates and loved ones worked to ensure that she was remembered as a person, not just a victim. Vigils, messages, and quiet acts of remembrance persisted, reinforcing the human cost behind the legal proceedings. Authorities reiterated that the investigation had been guided by evidence at every stage. They avoided public speculation about motive beyond what was supported by facts presented in court. This restraint mattered. In a case defined by loss, clarity and accuracy were forms of respect both for Mahogany and for the process meant to deliver justice. As the legal timeline extended, the family faced a different kind of endurance. Court dates, hearings, and delays became part of their reality. Justice, unlike grief, does not move at the pace of emotion. It moves at the pace of procedure. For many families, this gap can feel like another injury, but it is also the mechanism that ensures outcomes are not overturned or undone. The story of Mahogany Jackson's killing does not end neatly. Even as the case progresses through the courts, the absence remains permanent. What accountability can offer is not restoration, but recognition that a life was taken, that it mattered, and that the loss will not be ignored or minimized. In the end, this timeline resolves not with a sense of completion, but with responsibility placed where evidence demands to be. Mahogany's death reshaped lives, altered community, and left questions that will never be fully answered. What remains is the insistence on truth, the refusal to let silence replace justice, and the enduring memory of a young woman whose life ended violently, but whose story continues to be told with care and precision. By the time prosecutors were ready to speak plainly about who they believed was responsible for Mahogany Jackson's death, the case had already revealed its most disturbing truth. This was not an act committed in isolation. According to charging documents and court testimony, investigators concluded that Mahogany was surrounded not by a single attacker, but by a group people alleged to have acted together, each decision compounding the next until violence became inevitable. Authorities identified 8 individuals who were arrested and charged in connection with the crime. The state's theory was not that all played identical roles, but that each contributed to a chain of events that led to Mahogany's kidnapping, abuse, and killing. Some were charged with capital murder, others with felony murder, alongside charges including kidnapping, first-degree sodomy, and assault. The legal distinctions mattered, but the core allegation was unified. Mahogany Jackson was deliberately harmed while in control of others, and that harm ended her life. Investigators alleged that Mahogany was lured or taken to a location where she was held against her will. Evidence presented in court suggested prolonged abuse before her death, details that were shared sparingly, out of respect for the victim and her family, but firmly enough to justify the severity of the charges. Prosecutors argued that this was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a sequence of choices made by multiple people, none of whom intervened to stop what was happening. Among the accused, law enforcement indicated that one individual was believed to have fired the fatal shot. Others were accused of facilitating the kidnapping, participating in or enabling the assaults, or helping maintain control over Mahogany during the hours leading up to her death. In Alabama law, participation in such a crime can carry the same weight as pulling the trigger, a reflection of the principle that shared intent and action carry shared responsibility. The decision to seek the harshest possible charges underscored how seriously authorities viewed the case. Prosecutors stated that the evidence demonstrated extreme cruelty and disregard for human life. For Mahogany's family, hearing these allegations articulated in court was both validating and devastating. It confirmed what they feared, while forcing them to confront the depth of what she endured. As the legal process moved forward, each defendant was afforded the presumption of innocence, a cornerstone of the justice system. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of the evidence, questioned timelines, and scrutinized witness statements. This adversarial process, while painful to observe for loved ones, was essential to ensuring that any eventual verdict would withstand scrutiny. What remained constant throughout was Mahogany's presence in the room, even when she was not physically there. Her name was spoken repeatedly by prosecutors, by judges, by her family. She was not reduced to evidence alone. She was acknowledged as a person whose life had been violently taken and whose death demanded accountability. The case did not offer a clean emotional resolution. Arrests and charges did not restore what was lost. Court dates stretched on, marked by continuances and procedural steps that felt slow compared to the urgency of grief. Yet each hearing served a purpose: to move the case closer to a definitive judgment based on facts, not speculation. In the broader sense, the killing of Mahogany Jackson forced a reckoning beyond the courtroom. It raised questions about group violence, moral collapse, and the ease with which responsibility can dissolve when cruelty is shared. The fact that so many people were allegedly involved did not dilute guilt. It magnified it. As this timeline closes, the outcome remains rooted in process rather than finality. The accused faced the full weight of the legal system. Mahogany's family continues to carry her memory forward, insisting that her story be told accurately and without distortion. Justice, in this context, is not a moment, it is an ongoing commitment to truth. Mahogany Jackson's life ended in violence, but her name did not disappear into silence. It stands as a reminder of what happens when empathy fails, when accountability is delayed, and when a young woman's humanity is ignored. The law now carries the responsibility of responding. What it cannot do is erase the loss, only acknowledge it, and ensure it is neither forgotten nor repeated.